Good day. Today is 27th July 2025. Yesterday in my program I discussed the situation in Gaza, in Israel, and soon after I made that program, an announcement was made that the Israeli government has announced a partial ceasefire in Gaza. I am not sure what a partial ceasefire is in this context. For the record, I don't think it means anything very much. I don't think anything exactly is going to change. The situation remains as horrifying as ever. I personally continue to be horrified by it, though frankly my own feelings about this are trivial and irrelevant, and I'm even embarrassed to mention them, given the immensity of the events that are playing out. I have read, however, and this is why I brought up those feelings, an article by Alistair Crook on Conflicts Forum, in which he just mentions that he mentions an Israeli commentator, and I want to stress an Israeli commentator, pointing out that the last occasion when ghettos were established, the events didn't stop there but led to something far, far worse. That point is, of course, true, and, well, that was perhaps the trigger of causing my upset even further. Anybody who knows history will understand the truth of it. The article in itself is worth reading. It is on Conflict Forum's Substack. It is basically made up of a list of comments and statements by Israeli officials and former officials and commentators, all of whom are in deep shock and horror about the events that are taking place. One of them, I notice, is made by the Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Barak, who clearly is very disturbed and upset by these events, and who is talking about the need for a non-violent civil disobedience campaign leading to a complete shutdown of the country, to cause the current government and Prime Minister to step down and to rescue whatever moral and political status Israel still retains. Well, I wish the best of people like him, but to be frank, I'm becoming very doubtful that anything internal is going to change the sequence of events in Israel. External pressure, as I discussed in my program, at the last program, currently is not coming from the United States or from any of the Western countries. In fact, there, the pressure appears to be mostly on those people who criticize some, at least, of the actions that are taking place that are leading to this tragedy. But, as I discussed in my program, this is not going to continue for much longer. Come the autumn, I suspect that this crisis will develop in further ways which, well, will be very difficult, not just for the Israeli government, but for the Western governments that have been backing Israel over the course of this crisis as well. Well, that is all I feel able to say about the situation for the moment. No doubt I will have more to say soon. Absolutely, definitely will have more to say soon. But I have that feeling that we're heading into the darkest possible events, and sometime around the autumn, the full nature of what is coming will become apparent to everybody. Anyway, let us turn again to the situation in that other conflict, which is the one that I principally focus upon in these programs, which is the conflict in Ukraine, because it is the conflict which continues, in my opinion, to shape the international situation, the international environment. And I'm going to start by discussing briefly the situation in Pokrovsk and the military situation in general. Now, yesterday we had reports of confusion and panic on the part of the Ukrainian troops who were defending Pokrovsk, of advances into Pokrovsk from the south, and of continued pressure north of Pokrovsk as the Russians gradually close the vice, close their pincers around Pokrovsk. And, well, the reports spoke of a steadily, indeed rapidly, deteriorating situation. Well, all of that remains true. And in fact, the various mapping projects have now adjusted their maps further to show further Russian gains in southwest Pokrovsk. The Russians now seem to have established a strong position in southwest Pokrovsk. There are still reports that the Russians are seeking to break through into Mirnograd from the south. So far as I can judge, the Russians now control all the territory to the immediate south of Pokrovsk, though the Russian Defense Ministry has not yet made any announcements. It seems that all of the settlements and villages, the scattered villages that lie immediately to the south of Pokrovsk, have been captured by the Russian army as it presses its offensive against Pokrovsk itself. And, well, there's been further reports over the last few hours about the Russians advancing north from Novotoretskoye, which they captured a short time ago, and cutting the main road to another place called Shachove, a little to the east. And, well, that puts the Russians well to the north of Rodinske, and indeed of another village called Bilitske. But if they do have cut the road leading to Shachove, which is, as I say, a village well to the north of Pokrovsk, they've actually cut this village from the west, well, that enables the Russians to veer further west still and indeed cut the supply road which runs through Rodinske to the north of Rodinske itself. Incidentally, it also puts the Russians in a position where they can straighten their lines between the village of Shachove and Yablunovka, which is part of the battles, seen as part of the battles for Constantinfka. There is basically one big village called Poltavka. If the Russians capture that village, which they perhaps might decide to do, then, as I said, all the lines have been straightened and there would be a continuous position linking the Russian forces that are accumulating north and east of Pokrovsk and the Russian forces that are now gradually moving to encircle Constantinfka. In fact, it would put the Russians closer to that situation where, if Pokrovsk falls, they would be able to advance northwards and basically outflank Russian defenses, not just Ukrainian defenses, not just in Constantinivka, but in the other two towns further north, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk as well. Anyway, all of this, as I said, continues, but there's been more news now, more news that the Russians have indeed entered the territory of the Dmitrov coal mine, which lies between Mirnograd and Novoekonomichny, which the Russians, of course, have now captured. There's apparently a major battle underway for control of this coal mine. It's generally acknowledged that if this coal mine does indeed fall, then the Russians are in a position to break into Mirnograd from the east And at that point, the pressure on the Ukrainian forces inside Pokrovsk will worsen still further. There's been a bleak account of the situation in Pokrovsk, in Strana, which is a dissident Ukrainian website. I believe it's published outside Ukraine now, but it still reports news very interestingly from a Ukrainian perspective. And by the way, I consider it to be a very high quality and high standard website indeed. Anyway, the fighting in Pokrovsk is intensifying, and exactly what the course of events is going to take, I'm not sure. As I said in my program yesterday, I'm not going to make any definite predictions about the timeline because the information coming from Pokrovsk is so confusing as to the state of the actual battle inside the city that it's very difficult, impossible in fact, in my opinion, to make any definite conclusions about the state of the battle there. But we have had one further piece of information, video information of another kind. A series of videos has now appeared of Russian bombing of Pokrovsk. Clearly, Russian fighter bombers, Sukhoi 34s, are operating closely around Pokrovsk now. The bombing of the city is intensifying, and the whole city is covered in smoke, and one can see flashes right across the city from the exploding precision-guided fab bombs that are raining down on the city. And there's also pictures that have appeared from one of the high-rise areas to the south of Pokrovsk, in the southern part of Pokrovsk. This is the typical Soviet-style big housing complexes with big high-rise buildings. We saw those in Volchansk, for example, and in other places. I seem to remember that Avdiivka had a complex of an area like that, and of course so did Chasiv Yar. Anyway, this area again is referred to by some people as the Citadel. It is located in the southeast of Pokrovsk, and presumably a significant Ukrainian force is there trying to defend it. I have to say that I am deeply sorry for those Ukrainian soldiers in this citadel area, because the bombing of it is just, it seems to be on a simply terrifying scale. You can see these high-rise buildings being steadily pulverized as the big fab bombs, 500 kilos, 1500 kilos, rain down on this part of Pokrovsk, as well as, by the way, other parts of Pokrovsk too. But the bombing seems to be particularly concentrated in this area. Towards the end of the Battle of Avdiivka, I remember that the Russians were engaged in extremely heavy bombing of Avdiivka. I seem to remember that at one point, around 200 fab bombs were being recorded as falling on Avdiivka every single day. I think that the intensity of the bombing of Pokrovsk is probably around the same. Pokrovsk is a much bigger place than Avdiivka, so even if the same number of bombs are being dropped on Pokrovsk as were being dropped on Avdiivka, by definition, within any time period, the damage is going to be less. But of course, the Russian Air Force is bigger and more powerful today than it was in February 2024 when Avdiivka fell. So it's not impossible that the bombing of Pokrovsk is going to intensify. The pressure on the city and on the Ukrainian garrison is tremendous. There continue to be reports that communications are being constantly interrupted and jammed, that the Ukrainian troops in Pokrovsk often have little idea where the Russians exactly are, that there is a breakdown in some respects of the command structures inside Pokrovsk. As I said, I'm not giving a timeline, and I suspect that the Ukrainians will have deployed some of their best remaining troops to Pokrovsk. But I do ask myself how long this situation can continue. I remember asking myself the same question during the battle for Avdiivka a year and a half ago. Anyway, that is the military picture in and around Pokrovsk. Whilst I'm on the subject, I should say that there's been actually quite a lot of information about the tactical development of the Russian Air Force over the last few years. And from what I can gather, and of course again, information here is extremely thin, but the Russian Air Force has now basically given the military industries, the military industrial industries, the aircraft building factories, to concentrate production on two types of tactical aircraft. One is the Sukhoi 57 fifth generation fighter jet. Now, apparently, allegedly, around 12 of these fighter jets were built in 2023. That increased to 20 in 2024. The production rate is increasing to 36 this year. And it's expected to grow significantly beyond that next year. Now, that doesn't sound very impressive, and in some respects it's not. I believe I am right in saying that if we're talking about the US Air Force, production of F-35s is running at around 3 a week, whereas if these figures are correct, production of Sukhoi 57s is running at around 3 a month. So that's perhaps the difference. But it's still, I suspect, an awful lot higher than what we see in Europe at the present time. Now, it's also likely the case that production of Sukhoi 57 fifth generation fighters is going to continue to increase, and that the production numbers will be higher, significantly higher than next year. Again, if you go back in time and read about production of advanced fighter jets during the Soviet era, you find a similar sort of increase, steady increase over several years, until finally a plateau, usually of at a much higher level, is finally achieved, and then production continues at that rate for some time. Now, the other tactical aircraft, which apparently the Russian Air Force wants the aircraft industries to focus on, is precisely the Sukhoi 34 ground attack and tactical bomber. And here I have no production numbers at all, but I understand that these are increasing as well. These are the two aircraft that have proved themselves in the area of the special military operation, and which are the primary focus of the Russian Air Force. And though other aircraft like the Sukhoi 35 and the Sukhoi 30 continue to be built, they're being given less priority, so that the focus can be on the other two. Now, that is, in my opinion, the correct way in which industrial and military processes should be conducted. It's very different from what you see in the West, where certainly in Europe, industries are very fragmented and all kinds of aircraft and projects run simultaneously alongside each other. Anyway, that was just a diversion from the main topic of this program, of this up to now, which is the military situation in Ukraine. Now, that's Pokrovsk. There is a battle of, I suspect, only marginally less intensity playing out south of Constantinfka. My sense is that the battle for Constantinfka is, in terms of its timeline, something like 2 months behind Pokrovsk. The area, Constantinfka is a more difficult place because whereas Pokrovsk is a town basically isolated from the others and alone on the steppes, Constantinfka forms part of that heavy, dense, urban landscape so characteristic of Donbass, almost completely merges into, well, basically two conurbations. The Severodonetsk, Lysychansk conurbation, which then expands into the Bakhmut, and Solidar and Chasiv Yar conurbation, which then, as I said, reaches close into Constantinfka. And then, of course, Constantinfka is itself part of a major conurbation to the north, which includes Slavyansk and Kramatorsk and other places as well. So the urban landscape here is very dense. Of course, I also forgot to mention Toretsk, which is also nearby. And of course, Toretsk itself was heavily connected to the town of Gorlovka, which has always been under Russian control. And of course, the other big urban settlement in the area, which is the settlement of New York. All of those are under Russian control now. But anyway, this is a much more dense urban landscape in northern Donbass than in the area around Pokrovsk. And that is why progress for the Russians in this area has been much slower, because they've had to fight their way through this constant network of cities. But anyway, just as the Russians have cleared all the positions to the south of Pokrovsk, all of the villages and settlements that are not contiguous to Pokrovsk itself are now under Russian control in the southern part, south of Pokrovsk. So the same thing now is happening in Constantinfka, in the area of Constantinfka. So I mentioned recently, just a couple of programs ago, that the Russians have taken control of the big village of Yablunovka. Surprisingly, there is still no confirmation of this from the Russian Defense Ministry, even though there are photographs of Russian soldiers raising flags in every part of Yablunovka for the moment, or in existence. The Russians have also apparently captured the important village of Alexandro Kalinovo, which is located to the east of Yablunovka, and they have also captured the village of Sherbinovka, which is located to the west of Toretsk. And if we go a little further east, the Russians, of course, control Toretsk itself, and they have now recently captured places like Dachny, Dilivka. In fact, there's two villages, confusingly, both called Dilivka in this area, but from what I can tell, the Russians control both of them, and they also captured, about 5 days ago, the village of Belagora, whose name, White Hill, might imply that it is on higher ground. And there are some reports that the Russians have now captured the village of Alexandro Shultina, which is located immediately to the west of Belagora. And they also have captured a village called Plasheevka, which is located to the southwest of Alexandru Shultina. They captured that village some time ago. Now, that leaves two villages, Kleban-Bik and Katerinovka, which are still under Ukrainian control and which lie immediately to the south of the Kleban-Bik reservoir. Now, I spoke about the intense bombing of Pokrovsk. Video footage has now also appeared of these two villages, Kleban-Bik and Katerinovka, and they too are being bombed, so far as I can tell, round the clock by the Russian Air Force. The big fab bombs continue to fall on these two villages. They are being blasted out of existence. Again, one has to feel sorry, at least I feel sorry, for the Ukrainian soldiers that find themselves holding these two villages. And the other thing to say about them is that they are trapped. The Russians control the villages to the north and northeast of the reservoir, the Kleban-Bik reservoir, and they control the villages to the east, Alexandru Shultina and Yablunovka. To the north is a body of water, the Kleban-Bik reservoir itself. Perhaps it is not that deep. Perhaps men can either ford it or swim across it. So the idea of doing so with drones flying overhead all the time, and it's worth remembering that drones, the FPV drones that the Russians have, many of them have thermal images so that they can see the movement of men and machines at night. Anyway, I mean, the idea of trying to cross a body of water in order to escape these two villages and escape to Constantinfka, I mean, it hardly bears thinking about. The effect, well, the consequences for any soldiers that tried to escape these two villages, Kleban-Bik and Katerinovka, in that way, would be grisly. And, well, again, I don't want to say much more. Now, if all of these places fall, there is still a few villages left closer to Constantinfka itself. There's villages like Pretyochnine, which I believe is still under Ukrainian control, and villages like Ilinivka and Dovka Balka and Stepanovka. But it's difficult to imagine that the battle for Constantinfka itself would not, in that case, begin very soon. And there's been a lot less news recently about the fighting in Chasiv Yar. The last I heard, there was still a small group of Ukrainian troops holding out in a small group of buildings, probably more of these big apartment buildings in the micro-district of Yuzhny to the south of Chasiv Yar. But I suspect that once all of these other places have been cleared, the Russians will make a point of clearing the Ukrainians from this last remaining place south of Chasiv Yar. And then with the Russians now well established west of Constantinfka, as I've already discussed, and of course if they capture places like Dobropilia and Pokrovsk, it's be clear, I think, that Constantinfka would be in effect encircled. Well, one can begin to see how the second half of the Russian offensive would play out. Constantinfka would be effectively encircled, and to be frank, I doubt that the Ukrainians would be able to defend themselves there. for very long, especially given that apparently Constantinfka is on low ground compared to all of the territory that the Russians control around it. So anyway, that is the situation in the main battlefronts. As I said, the situation for the Ukrainians is deteriorating by the hour. There continue to be optimistic claims on the part of some reporters sympathetic to Ukraine. Not so much, I've noticed, from Ukrainians themselves. The actual Ukrainian aligned, or actual Ukrainian telegram channels and reporting sites are becoming increasingly pessimistic and indeed alarmed about the situation, the military situation on the battle lines. And in fact, I would add something else, which is that a certain level of fatalism is now starting to develop, which I have never seen in Ukrainian sites at any point in the special military operation before. Previously, there would be anger, there would be furious condemnation of the mistakes of the high command, but there would nonetheless be an atmosphere of resolve, or at least defiance. Now we've gone beyond panic in some cases towards fatalism, a fatalism which seems to be not just about the ability of Ukraine to hold on to places like Pokrovsk and Constantinfka, but a fatalism about Ukraine's prospects in the war as a whole. Just saying. But anyway, you still get the odd claim and report that the Ukrainians are concentrating forces near to Pokrovsk, that they're going to launch some kind of great counterattack there. There's even some claims, which I must admit don't make any kind of sense to me, that the Ukrainians are thinking of some kind of offensive towards Selidovo, south of Pokrovsk. Selidovo, by the way, the Russians captured it in the autumn, and it is now apparently the forward base for the Russian attack on Pokrovsk. That is where the headquarters of the force that is attacking Pokrovsk is located. That is where the main logistics and supplies for this force are concentrated, are sent through to the frontline troops, who in the Pokrovsk area are said to number, by the way, around 111,000. At least that's the Ukrainian estimate. Anyway, I don't myself believe that there is going to be a Ukrainian counterattack in Pokrovsk. No doubt, as is always the way with Zelensky and Syrskyi, they continue to feed reserves into trying to hold what are in effect lost positions. I would say that Pokrovsk does seem to me to be an important place, and I can see why the Ukrainians would want to defend Pokrovsk. But there does come a point where even a defense of an important place becomes, well, it loses its rationale, especially if one is sacrificing lives in order to achieve it. But anyway, regardless, the situation does appear to be getting more critical by the day. I don't believe the Ukrainians have the forces left to mount a successful counteroffensive in this area, and I think it is frankly delusional to believe that they do. So that's what I would say on that issue. Now, yesterday I read a report. It was on a Substack blog, which goes by the name of Events in Ukraine. I have been reading it for a while. It can be a little hit or miss, but its analysis generally, in my opinion, tends to be reasonably sound. Anyway, they gave some further assessments of the overall state of the Ukrainian military. And they speak about a Ukrainian military that is basically melting away. According to them, the rate of loss is now so high that, and the exhaustion of the military is so great, that the actual frontline strength of the Ukrainian military, which this blog puts at, well, it puts the force at about 400,000, though only part of that are effective fighters able to hold positions on the front lines. Anyway, it says that Ukraine is experiencing a net loss on the battlefronts of between 10 and 15,000 men a month. And if that is correct, we could see how the situation, how the military could be shrinking. It spoke about how if this level of loss were to continue for 2 years, there would be literally no one left on the front lines able to continue fighting. Well, obviously we will never get to that point, because that kind of rate of loss is going to lead to a collapse much sooner, long before we reach that point. Now, I am not vouching for these figures. I have received, as I said, a detailed analysis of Ukrainian losses and Russian losses, which I'm still working through and trying to understand, but which seem to me, just to say, perhaps better worked out and more thought through than any others which I have read so far. Just saying. What I would say is that the rate of loss that this blog, Events in Ukraine, is providing is not out of line in any way from the data about the rate of loss that I received from this private source. Now, always, of course, when receiving this kind of information, one has to be very careful about the phenomenon of confirmation bias, because one already believes something, it becomes tempting to assume that evidence that seems to corroborate it must be true. And as I said, it's a trap into which many analysts fall. But anyway, for the record, I suspect that overall this is roughly correct. And it follows the pattern of other attrition wars. Attrition is not something that is well understood. The point is that the military that is suffering most from the attrition, the rate that it loses effectiveness beyond a certain point compounds. So whereas at one point it could absorb a loss of 10,000 men a month, beyond a certain point, if that rate of loss continues, we have an accelerating collapse, because by then the military has shrunk to such a level that it cannot absorb that level of loss anymore. The textbook case of this is the Confederate Army during the American Civil War. If one follows the pattern of the American Civil War, one can see this process play out. So the Confederates attempted their big offensive in 1863. It was defeated by the Union, by the North, at Gettysburg. Then there followed a long, difficult battle of attrition, which took up the rest of 1863, all of 1864. It continued into the early part of 1865, and then the collapse came. And at the time of the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, General Lee's army had been reduced to only a fraction of its former size and basically wasn't able to continue fighting effectively anymore. And the result was that this collapse came rapidly and was sudden. An army that was holding its positions in 1864, by April 1865, was basically no longer able to do so. And I'm not saying that this is the position that Ukraine is in at the moment, but one can start to see how we're moving ever more rapidly, if these numbers are correct, to that place. And I would suggest that the problems the Ukrainians are suffering on the battlefronts strongly suggest this. Strana is saying that the Ukrainians no longer have enough forces to hold the entire front line. They've been over-depending on drones. As we all know, the Russians now have a decisive advantage in drones, including, of course, FPV drones. There are large gaps in the front lines through which the Russians are able to infiltrate, and this is one of the factors that is causing Ukrainian resistance to crumble in places like Pokrovsk. So one can see this play out on the battlefronts. A Russian military journalist called Sladkov, one of the most revered journalists of that nature in Russia, has actually made a similar point. He said that the primary strategy of the Russian military at the present time is to give the Ukrainians no rest, to attack them constantly in every place, all the time, to force the Ukrainians to keep fighting, exhausting them, grinding them down, causing them to lose ground, and to maintain the pace of the attrition. And he says that whenever the Ukrainians try to redeploy forces to hold one position, the Russians attack them in that other position where they've had to withdraw those forces from, obliging the Ukrainians to make difficult choices about where they are expected to hold, and keeping the Ukrainians constantly, relentlessly under pressure. So anyway, this is attrition. But to repeat again, attrition is often followed by, well, first maneuver and then collapse. Personally, I expect that once Pokrovsk falls, then things will start to happen much more rapidly. Probably the Constantinfka, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk area as well. Now, I've focused on those two places. There is a lot of fighting going on in other places. I discussed the Russian advances near Siversk. It seems that there is now no real doubt that the Russians have indeed cleared the Serebyanka forest, and it's likely that they will finish the battle for the village of Serebyanka itself. There's been lots of discussions about who controls the village of Torske, a little to the west of Siversk itself. Whether it's the Russians or the Ukrainians, the Russian Defense Ministry claimed some months ago that the Russians controlled Torske, but the Ukrainians have claimed that they recaptured it over the course of a counterattack. There is no doubt that the Russians are there again now. Whether they are there to fight a battle for Torske against Ukrainian troops still trying to defend the town, or whether they've always been there and the claims that the Ukrainians recaptured it false, I have absolutely no way of being able to say. But the fact is that it does look as if we are coming towards the final weeks of the long battle of Siversk. I suspect that the garrison, the Ukrainian garrison, which has very bravely and successfully defended Siversk and the surrounding villages since 2022, is now again at risk of being surrounded and is facing forces that it simply cannot withstand, because Ukrainian resources are now so overstretched that the defenders of Siversk are no longer getting the supplies or the reinforcements that they need to hold their positions. And there are continuing Russian advances in western Donbass, advances that I'm not going to discuss in any detail in this program. Suffice to say that the Russians, over the last 36 hours, have made a whole series of announcements, just as I said that they would do in my previous program, talking about further places, further territory in western Donetsk region, the very western end of Donetsk region, and in Dnipropetrovsk region. They've announced a whole succession of further captures there, and it looks to me as if Ukrainian positions in the important town of Novopavlivka are also now under threat of encirclement as well. Anyway, lots going on. There's also talk about a Russian attack south of Zaporozhye city. That the Russians there recently captured the village of Kamenskaya. They're supposed to have captured another village called Plavny. They're said to be attacking the village of Stepnogorsk, a heavily built, modern village of high-rise buildings. I talked about it some programs ago. I expressed my skepticism that it really is as much of an obstacle for the Russians as Ugledar once was. People have made parallels between Stepnogorsk and Ugledar. But anyway, regardless, there is apparently fighting underway for control of that village as well. The point is that the Russians are advancing and pushing everywhere. Now, the one place where the Ukrainians are still showing energy, where they still seem to be sending reinforcements and still continue to conduct counterattacks, is in Sumy region. They've recently claimed to have recaptured the village of Kondratyova in Sumy region, that they provided so far no pictures to confirm that. At least I haven't seen any. The Russians, by the way, say that they have made advances in Sumy region themselves and that they have captured other villages there, though the long battle for Yunakovka continues. And it seems that Sumy region continues to get the pick of whatever reinforcements Zelensky and Syrsky are able to send. It continues to receive priority over places like Constantinfka and Pokrovsk, not to mention Siversk, and perhaps even Zaporozhye itself. Now, I think any objective analyst would find this extremely surprising. But I have already talked about this in the past. It has always seemed to me that many people continue to struggle to understand what Zelensky's ultimate objectives in this war now are. For him, the loss of Donbass, the loss of positions in southern Donbass or Dnipro region, the effect of the Russians breaking through to the Dnieper River, for him, for Zelensky himself, that is less critical, less important than control of Kiev, the capital city, where, of course, he remains present, where his main residence is, and where he continues to be president. Because, as I said in many programs. For Zelensky, the nightmare with which the war started was the one in which the Russian army was located north and east of Kiev itself, where a Russian column briefly broke into Kiev and advanced in February 2022 along Krashatik, the main road in Kiev, and came within a couple of 100 meters of Zelensky's residence. It's the situation where he was hiding for a time in a bunker, where he appeared, as I remember, on one occasion in a press conference, exhausted and unshaven, and the Western journalists found it almost impossible to understand what he was saying. And this, for him, is the nightmare moment in the war, when that situation returns, when he finds himself in that position again. And his priority is to keep the Russians as far from Kiev as possible. If he has to sacrifice important positions in the south of Ukraine to keep them, if only for a few more weeks or months, away from Kiev, emotionally, he will do it. But putting aside these psychological pressures on Zelensky, there's also the important political ones. Because whilst Zelensky and his government are in control of Kiev, which is Ukraine's capital, there can be no political challenge to them for leadership of Ukraine. But if Zelensky and his government lose Kiev, then of course their position as Ukraine's government becomes much more questionable and ultimately depends on the continued support of the West, which can no longer be taken for granted in quite the same way. So, given that Zelensky's priority, as I have been saying in several programs, in many programs now, is to retain control of Ukraine politically, right up until the moment of final collapse, and then to continue to preserve the position of Zelensky being the president of Ukraine, even after that collapse comes, by perhaps establishing the government in Lvov or even in the West. Given that this is so, it remains essential for Zelensky to hold on to his positions, to hold on to Kiev for as long as he can, and right up to the last possible moment. So, given that Sumy region and the city of Sumy are on the main road to Kiev, given that this is the road that the Russian army used to advance on Kiev from the east back in February 2022, given that other important towns and cities that are vital for the defense of Kiev, like Chernigov and Kharkiv, are also located in northeastern Ukraine, east of the Dnieper River, it is entirely unsurprising that the main focus of Zelensky's attention and energy has been in precisely this area. This is where he has sought to defend Kharkiv and defend Sumy, where he has launched his offensive into Kursk region, where he has spoken about further offensives against Russia, and where, of course, he's also launched his cross-border attacks into Belgorod region as well. So it is completely unsurprising that he is giving the Ukrainian forces in northeastern Ukraine the pick of the equipment and of the reinforcements to hold their positions. As I mentioned a short while ago in one of my programs, a member of one of the nationalist brigades who has been in contact with me has passed on to me information that the talk within the brigade is that it must prepare for the final climactic battle, which is going to be the battle for Kiev itself. And, well, one can see that even at the level of these elite brigades, it is the need to defend Kiev right up until the end, the bitterest end, that is widely internalized and understood, and is not, by the way, disputed. Now, speaking of Zelensky, he has made further video programs and addresses to the Ukrainian people. I noticed that in his latest, one of his speeches, he's now blaming the entire debacle for the placing of NABU and SAPO, the two Ukrainian anti-corruption agencies, under the direct control of the prosecutor general. He is blaming the Ukrainian parliament for this. He says that the idea all came from them, that he had nothing to do with it, that it was referred, that it was the parliament itself that decided to run with this idea. It was they who stripped out all the provisions guaranteeing the independence of these organizations. The fact that he signed the resulting law without any hesitation or delay, well, presumably that was a mistake, and ultimately this entire law had nothing to do with him. Of course, if you believe that, if you really believe that, then I have a bridge to sell you. There was yesterday further reports about how the Parliament, the same institution that Zelensky is now blaming for passing the law in the first place, the Parliament, the Ukrainian Parliament, was balking at the amendments, the revisions to the law that Zelensky is now proposing, or the cancellation of the law and its replacement with a different law. Some members of Zelensky's party have now come forward and they say that they have no idea what Zelensky's talking about. Well, they haven't put in quite those words, but in effect, that's what they're saying. That the reports, which, by the way, also appeared in the Financial Times, are wrong. That actually they're all ready to follow Zelensky's lead and to pass the new replacement law, and that there really is no problem about this. I am sure that they will indeed vote for this replacement law, because I don't myself believe that it is going to change the substantive position of NABU and SAPO. I continue to believe that they will be effectively under Zelensky's control. I discussed this all at length yesterday in my last program. However, on this topic, I would say two things. Firstly, I've seen a still picture of Zelensky making perhaps this address, perhaps it was a different address. Zelensky often, as I said, speaks in this kind of way. And it was against a white backdrop. And, well, one has to be very careful because, one, I am not somebody who's able to see pictures very well. And secondly, the caption perhaps was a little misleading, but the caption said that Zelensky looked haggard and exhausted in this picture, in this photograph. Photographs can be made to give that impression of someone. But for the record, when I saw this picture, before reading that caption, that was the impression I got as well. he looked dreadful. Now, as I said, that might have been retouching and distortion, or it may be that he just was short of sleep. It wouldn't be surprising. But he certainly, in that photograph, didn't look like the vigorous and strong and healthy leader that he has at times appeared to be. Anyway, that's one thing, and of course that's purely a impression, and I might be wrong about it. If he is exhausted and demoralized, as he seemed to me to be in that photo, then of course the situation on the battlefronts and the gathering crisis in the economy and altogether would go very far to explain it. But the other thing about the picture was that it was taken against a white backdrop. Now again, the caption suggested that Zelensky has retreated back into his bunker again. He's no longer working from his office in Bankova, the building which is his residence in Kiev. I would say that I have seen other pictures, very recent pictures, which clearly show Zelensky still in his office. But maybe he is becoming increasingly nervous and has indeed started to use his bunker again rather more. One should resist, by the way, any historical parallels. I have no expectation that he will end his life or anything like that in the bunker. Quite the opposite, actually. So any speculations to that effect, I am sure, are completely wrong. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about him. One reason why he might have retreated to his bunker is that even as the Russians batter the Ukrainians on the front lines, they continue to launch massive missile and drone strikes against Ukraine. And they did so again on a massive scale the night before. And this was not last night, but the previous night, but I've only just caught up with the extent of this drone and missile strike. Now, there's some claims that the Russians used fewer drones this time. The Ukrainians say they only used 230 Duran drones. I would be skeptical about any number that the Ukrainians now give. But for the record, 230 drones is still an awful lot of drones. A year ago, it would have appeared to have been an enormous number of drones. The Russians also this time launched a lot of missiles, and from what I could see, it was mainly Iskander ground-launched ballistic missiles. And from what I can tell, one of the main targets were the two cities of Zaporozhye and Dnipro on the Dnieper River. And it's not difficult to understand why the Russians would launch attacks against these two cities, because they are both key transportation hubs for the Ukrainians, sending equipment and supplies to their forces east of the Dnieper. And of course, they're both major industrial cities, playing a significant role in whatever's left of Ukraine's military-industrial economy. But anyway, the point I want to make is that this was another big attack. Apparently many more missiles were used of this kind than recently. The Russian missiles and drones continue to strike Ukraine. The pressure there is unrelenting, just as it is on the battlefronts. Russian strategic bombing, if you like, of Ukraine is done with missiles and drones. Tactical bombing is done by Russian aircraft using fab bombs, though quite often drones, Duran drones and other types of drones are used for that also. And of course, on the actual front lines, the shelling by the Russian artillery is relentless. Anyway, that is the situation on the battlefronts. Now, President Trump has made certain comments over the last couple of hours. He said that it's possible that he could impose secondary sanctions on Russia and on countries that support Russia soon. The operative word is could. I would say that that is an important qualifier. It's starting to look as if President Trump no longer intends to do that in September, in the 50-day time that he had initially warned about. And I also noticed that President Trump is saying that he expects Putin and Zelensky to hold a summit meeting, but he expects that to happen in 2 to 3 months' time. Now that, it seems to me, if taken together with his other comment about how secondary sanctions could be enforced, that also suggests that Trump is trying to at least foster the impression that some kind of diplomatic process is underway. I cannot see it myself. On the question of a summit meeting between Putin and Zelensky, the Russians only yesterday reiterated again, I think it was Peskov, that there can be no summit meeting between Zelensky and Putin until the outlines, the final outlines of the peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine have already been agreed. And what we saw from the meeting in Istanbul that took place earlier this week is that the Russians and the Ukrainians are as far apart on this as ever. I do not believe that Zelensky is ever going to make the substantive concessions on NATO membership, on EU membership, on loss of the 4 regions, recognizing the loss of the 4 regions, on reducing the size of the Ukrainian armed forces, on Ukraine's neutrality. I cannot imagine Zelensky, by this point in the war, agreeing to any of these things. So when Donald Trump says that Zelensky and Putin will meet in 2 to 3 months' time, we should take that as we should have taken his earlier claims that the war would be over within 24 hours of him becoming president, that there would be a ceasefire by Easter of this year, that the fighting would be ended within 100 days of his becoming president. All of those things. There is nothing to suggest that. It seems to me, however, that President Trump, and ultimately the United States, are trying to find themselves wriggle room to escape the problems, the self-created problems that Trump made for himself when he announced that ultimatum. Now, for the rest, the European Union continues its long search for funding in order to buy Ukraine weapons and to help Ukraine continue the war. This despite the fact that acute observers are able to see that the war is in effect lost. There is an excellent article by Ben Harris on BNE Intelligence News about this situation. Ben Harris, I should say, is far from being unsympathetic to Ukraine, even though he's mostly reported from Russia. And he's very often very critical of President Putin. But Ben Harris makes a number of, I think, entirely valid points. He said Ukraine's war with Russia increasingly looks like it is lost. Ukraine is losing ground in the battle with Russia, albeit slowly. Slowly for the moment, but as I said, rapidly, I suspect, before very long. At the same time, the formal negotiations on the first cluster in Kiev's EU accession bid were supposed to start on July 18th, but that failed to happen. He is absolutely right about that, and I missed it. There was supposed to be negotiations on the 18th of July with a view to moving forward with Ukraine's EU membership bid, and they didn't take place. Note that this happened before Zelensky started to move against Nabu and Sapal, so it cannot be connected to that. And then Ben Aris says that since then, Ukrainian President Zelensky signed a law that defangs Ukraine's anti-corruption reforms, making it unlikely that the process for EU membership will be restarted. Ukraine's situation has rapidly decayed in just the last week. It now appears that Zelensky has given up on any hope of joining the EU anytime soon and has refocused on consolidating his control over domestic politics. The last, of course, is a point that we've been making on the Duran and which I have been making for some time. The EU, despite all of its resounding words of support for Ukraine, is now starting to drag its feet on Ukrainian membership. And that, as much as anything else, probably opened the way for Zelensky's assault on Nabu and Sapal. He's up to now probably been unwilling to act against those organizations because he did not want to compromise or risk Ukraine's EU membership bid. Now that that doesn't seem to be on the table, he says to himself, what's the point? Let's focus instead on the more important, the more pressing thing, which is consolidating control over domestic politics. And that, I believe, is what Zelensky is currently doing and what his priority is. Now that brings me back to the topic of the European Union. And I have to say that this is, for me, in many respects, a disagreeable topic. For most of my life, for far and away most of my life, I was a strong supporter of, well, it didn't used to be called the EU for most of that period. It was first the European Economic Community, then it became the European Community. You would not have found anyone more supportive, I suspect, of those agencies than me. It has been perhaps one of the most disillusioning experiences to see what it has become over the last 20, 30 years, and to recognize one's own, well, wrongness in what one has believed for most of one's adult life. But anyway, just to say, consider the situation that the EU is in now. The EU is currently trying to negotiate a trade deal with the United States. Donald Trump is threatening to impose 30% tariffs on the EU as of the 1st of August. There is supposed to be a negotiation underway to try to persuade him to reduce that, but there is bitter argument as to how that will be done within the EU itself, whether the EU should retaliate against Donald Trump's tariffs or whether they should roll over and accept them in the hope of getting a better deal, what exactly they should do. So relations between the EU and the United States at the moment are far from good. And it is an open secret that most EU leaders can't stand Donald Trump. Of course, they pretend otherwise. Macron, Merz pretend that they like Trump and that they get on with him. They flatter him whenever they can. Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, who just a few months ago was Prime Minister of the Netherlands, he is the past master of unctuous, sycophantic flattery where Donald Trump is concerned. Britain, of course, is not a member of the EU, but the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, also goes out of his way to flatter Donald Trump, even as he gradually edges Britain ever closer towards the very same EU that most British people, a majority of British people who voted to leave. Just to say. Anyway, the EU doesn't get on with Donald Trump. It doesn't like him. It absolutely doesn't like his vice president. It doesn't like the general direction of US policy. The EU is in conflict with Russia, a major conflict in Russia over Ukraine. The EU, of course, has been working and pressing for the last 25 years to bring Ukraine into the EU. It's furious that the Russians oppose this. It's backed Ukraine to the hilt. Its members, the member states, have imposed 18 successive sanctions packages since February 2022, on top of the earlier sanctions packages that they announced from back in 2014. As I said, they've been rolling out sanctions packages constantly. They've been so keen to pursue their conflict with Russia that they're even prepared to accept massive deindustrialization across Europe because they are so determined to continue this campaign against Russia. And of course, they have an increasingly bad relationship with China as well. The EU, Costa and Ursula von der Leyen met in Beijing with President Xi Jinping. There was apparently no points of understanding. Kaja Kallas, as I've discussed in recent programs, has had a row a few weeks ago, a massive 4-hour row, basically, with the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, in which she criticized China for every sin under the sun and was taken aback when Wang Yi gave as good as he got. Anyway, the EU has a dreadful relationship with China, which continues to get worse. The EU's relationship with many of the Arab states is also rocky. The EU's relationship with Turkey is never good, though perhaps for that they can be forgiven. It is extremely difficult and very, very demanding to be on good terms with President Erdogan. But anyway, for what it's worth, they're on bad terms with him also. Now, what that means is that there's, by general consensus, 3 great powers in the world: the United States, China, and Russia. And the EU is on bad terms with all of them. It is going through a process of deindustrialization. Its financial system is under extreme stress, budget crisis everywhere in the EU that you could see. There was a fine article which I recently read, I think it was in the Financial Times, about Germany's reckless spending binge under Chancellor Merz, with clear skepticism as to where it would eventually end. And the extraordinary thing about the EU is that even as they are on bad terms with absolutely everybody, even as everything is going wrong, they show no degree of self-awareness. They're not asking themselves, for example, if there might be something wrong with their conduct of foreign policy, that they've managed to quarrel not just with one of the world's three superpowers, but with all three of them at the same time. They don't ask themselves whether perhaps the time has come to show a little bit more flexibility and adjustment in their conduct of foreign policy. They haven't revised their views about their economic policies at all. I mean, if you want a picture of a runaway train with a driver who can only see forwards, except he doesn't see the fact that he's driving the train over the cliff, well, if you don't see that with the EU, then I just don't know what you think the EU is anymore. I say that I had a big argument recently with somebody close to me who continues to think very highly of the EU. I cannot see the basis any longer for doing so. Anyway, there it is. That's what I wanted to end the program on. Where Ukraine itself is concerned, the conflict there, I see no hope, personally, of any sort of diplomatic action being taken by the EU leaders to try to bring the conflict to an end. As I've said already, I don't think that President Zelensky is seriously interested in a negotiated solution that would bring the conflict to an end. And the greatest achievement of the EU leaders, if you can call it that, for which they are doubtless congratulating themselves, is their effective sabotage of Donald Trump's admittedly chaotic attempts over the course of the last year to bring the conflict in Ukraine to an end. So I wonder how much longer this can be sustained, how much longer we can have an institution in place in Europe which continues to deindustrialize Europe and destabilize its economy and its social system, and manages to pick quarrels with all of the non-European great powers. Probably for quite a long time, judging on what has been happening over the last 30 years. Though I would say that the arrogance and incompetence of the current crop of European leaders, even by comparison with the previous ones, people like Merkel, for example, might argue to the contrary. But anyway, I'm not going to push it. I just wanted to make that point. For the rest, the war in Ukraine goes on. I still expect it to continue into next year, just to make that clear. Though I suspect that by the time we get to the end of year, that there is a crisis in Ukraine will be all too obvious. And as I said in my program yesterday, it might be a crisis happening simultaneously with an even more acute crisis in the Middle East. But anyway, that's, I believe, where we are. No diplomatic action, no attempts to change things, no attempt to rethink the policies, endless repetition of the same memes, even, as I said, as the runaway train, with the driver firmly fixed, looking through his blinkers ever forward, trundles faster and faster towards the cliff. Anyway, that's my program for today. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.